All right, Isaiah 52, let's just call this one It Ain't Free, drawing on the old saying regarding the military, particularly our military, particularly our military, the U.S. military. Freedom ain't free. Say more Christian application. Understanding this is a passage that one talks about awakening Israel to the reality that they're no longer in bondage. Of course, first of all, prophesying that they are going to go into bondage and allowing this to help wake them up when they are in the midst of that bondage to realize once again it's not forever and now's the time to get going. For them, it's going to cost them nothing. The suffering they've been through is probably enough, but it is going to cost someone else something. And by the end, we're going to find out it's going to start off a rather lengthy passage going on into the next chapter talking about the Christ and what it cost him. However, starting in this chapter, as we mentioned, drawing from chapter 51, it is going to say, awake, awake, put on strength. As it goes on in verse 2, talk about the way in which they need to rise from the dust, to be seated and loose the bonds. Why? Because they are no longer in bondage. Verses 3 on through roughly 6 are going to talk about specifically the way in which they were sold for nothing. Therefore, they will be redeemed without money. Thus, the title, It Ain't Free. However, now it's talking about the way it is free to them. However, their condition has taken a toll on God's name. Understanding is going to talk about the way in which, in a very famous passage at the end of verse 5, he is going to say the situation in which they have found themselves has resulted in continually all the day my name is despised. And so God is going to put an end to it, as we said, finally loosing his people without additional cost to them. Verses 7 and 8, really 7 through 9, are going to go on and talk about the way in which, in another famous description, the feet of those who are bringing the good news to them, who are bringing the good news to them that their captivity is over. It's going to describe their feet as beautiful, catching me off guard because once you get out of the poetry of the statement, feet ain't usually something that are described as beautiful. However, if you are in a situation where you are down enough, things that ordinarily don't seem beautiful are going to seem real pretty to you, especially if they are picking you up out of a very difficult or distressing circumstance. So he will then go on to talk about beyond Israel, it is going to be a sign once again to the ends of the earth, verse 10, where it's going to then go on in verses 11 and 12 to say that it is then going to call them to have a different standard of character, not going back to the same things that provoked God to send them into bondage in the first place. Understanding that, he's going to call them to a higher level of character in verses 11 and 12, saying, depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing, go out from the midst of her, purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. Understanding that that is probably talking about the priests and the Levites particularly. However, understanding the difficulties they saw in resettling the nation in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, he was calling the entire nation to a higher level of purity and integrity than the one they displayed in the years leading up to the captivity. Understanding that one difference between them being freed now from Babylonian captivity and the exodus from Egyptian captivity is this: they don't have to go out in haste. God, in the last verse leading into the final 3 verses of the chapter, meaning verse 12, is specifically going to say he is going to be their rear guard and they don't have to run. They can walk out of captivity free this time. But as we said, it's free for them, but it's not free absolutely, as we see in the final 3 verses. Verse 13 beginning, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told to them, they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand. A passage that beyond kings causes me to shut my mouth. Understanding that when we talk about the whole concept of freedom not being free, sometimes we talk about it from the perspective of an entire military having to go out to pay a price of sacrificing and being away from their families so that they can make sure that in the States, there's a level of freedom that exists that probably wouldn't without their sacrifice. However, there is another level of individual sacrifice at times attached to an atrocity so great that it causes people who once had hardened hearts to open their eyes and their ears and their hearts to change. Thus our thumbnail. Because for years I had a hard time, once I even realized that this passage was in the Bible, wondering what it looked like, until I finally put two and two together and saw the picture of Emmett Till. And while I do not believe that there is any one picture that can fully represent what Christ actually suffered, willingly suffered, to set us free, we do have a picture from our own recent history of a young man who was beaten and marred beyond human semblance, whose own sacrifice opened up freedom for many. And so as I try to journey towards understanding what it actually cost the Christ to set all of us free, this chapter reminded me of the very first photo that made it crystal clear to me that the freedom that was free to me was not completely free.